They said the convent was the safest place in Oklahoma, a fortress of stone, silence, and sanctity. But that was before the night Sister Magdalene stepped out of the chapel, pale as moonlight, clutching her swollen belly as if holding a secret that could set the whole territory on fire. That night, when the church bell rang without a hand touching it, every nun awoke with the same chilling thought: something unholy has entered our holy walls. By sunrise, the scandal had exploded across the countryside. The 51-year-old nun was pregnant, and the church wanted only one thing: silence. The convent of St. Aurelia had stood for nearly a century, a place where rules weighed heavier than the stone arches above the altar. The sisters lived by discipline, by devotion, by the belief that suffering was a pathway to salvation. But behind the walls, beneath the chapel, the silence hid more than prayer. It hid fears, it hid secrets, it hid a history that no scripture could cleanse. Sister Magdalene had always been different. She prayed harder than anyone, fasted longer, and carried guilt like a second skin. Her hair had gone white early, her hands thin as parchment, yet her eyes burned with a fervor that frightened even the Mother Superior. For decades she had obeyed the vow of purity, believing that God had chosen her for a life without earthly desire. But something changed the day the plantation owner sent a young enslaved boy to the convent for labor. He was hardly more than a youth, quiet, observant, obedient in the way only someone raised under cruelty learns to be. He swept floors, carried water buckets, patched fences, and though he tried to shrink into the corners, his presence stirred the air. To some he was merely another servant. To Sister Magdalene he became an omen, a sign she could not interpret yet could not ignore. At first the other sisters dismissed her strange behavior. She lingered in the hallways where he worked. She volunteered to deliver meals to the cellars where he slept on a thin mat. She asked him questions about faith, about dreams, about survival. They said she spoke to him with a softness she never showed anyone else, and as the months passed, an unease settled over the convent like dust on an abandoned pew. Then came the night when everything changed. No one heard a scream, no one heard a cry, only muffled footsteps down the back corridor and the sound of a door closing softly. After that, the sisters noticed a shift. In her voice, her eyes, her very breathing. She prayed less. She watched the storms through the windows. She touched her stomach absent-mindedly, and when the faintest swell appeared beneath her habit, she called it a divine sign. But the church had no room for miracles that did not fit its rules. Priests arrived under the guise of retreat, though their faces were heavy with suspicion. They interrogated nuns in candle-lit rooms, asking the same questions again and again. They demanded to know who had broken the vow, what had been seen, what had been heard. Some sisters trembled, others lied, but none dared speak the truth, that the boy had been seen with Sister Magdalene more often than Scripture allowed. Then one morning he vanished. His mat was empty, his few belongings scattered, no tracks led to the forest, no horses were taken. Some whispered he had escaped, others whispered he had been removed. The priests offered no explanation, and still Sister Magdalene grew heavier. When the truth could no longer be denied, she stood in the chapel before the candles and declared before the entire convent that God had chosen her womb, that the child she carried was a blessing, not a sin. Some sisters gasped, some fell to their knees, others crossed themselves, so quickly their hands blurred. The Mother Superior fainted. Outside, news spread faster than wildfire. Farmers rode miles to glimpse the miracle nun. The church, terrified of scandal, issued secrecy orders, but it was too late. The story had already taken its first breath. And soon, so would the child, the one people would whisper about for generations, the one born in a storm that shook the windows of St. Aurelia so violently the nuns believed the heavens themselves were watching. What happened before the birth was a scandal. What happened after became a legend. St. Aurelia's convent was built on a hill of stone and silence, a place where the world believed holiness lived, but those inside knew holiness was only the first disguise. Travelers who passed by saw tall arches, whitewashed walls, and gardens filled with lilies trembling in the Oklahoma wind. Bells chimed at dawn, incense clung to the air, and hymns rose like smoke from the chapel windows. To the outside world it was a sanctuary, a sacred refuge, a place where sin could not survive. But to the women who lived behind those walls, the convent was something far more complicated, a place where obedience was demanded, where secrets were buried deeper than coffins, and where silence was a weapon used more often than prayer. The convent was founded decades before Sister Magdalene ever arrived. Its purpose was never truly spiritual. The church used it as a vault, a quiet corner of the frontier where inconvenient women could be hidden away. Some were too outspoken. Some were sent by families ashamed of them. Some carried burdens the church wanted erased. Over time, St. Aurelia became less a place of devotion and more a place of containment. The nuns lived like ghosts, obedient and unseen, each one shaped by rules that weighed heavier than iron chains. Life inside St. Aurelia followed a merciless rhythm. Wake before dawn. Pray until the bones in your knees ached. Work in silence, fast in silence, sleep in silence. Every choice was swallowed by routine. Anything human was treated as a temptation. A flicker of anger was considered the devil. A moment of curiosity was sin. A single tear had to be wiped away before another nun saw it. Under such strictness, emotions didn't die. They twisted. They hid. They grew sharp in the dark. By the time Sister Magdalene arrived in her youth, the convent had already consumed generations of women. She entered faithfully, believing sacrifice would bring her closer to God. But years of isolation, of punishments disguised as piety, wore her thin. The rules intended to purify her instead hollowed her out. She spoke rarely, fasted often, and forced herself into a shape she believed was holy. Yet something inside her remained untouched, like a small flame smothered, but not extinguished. This fragile balance began to crack the day the plantation owner sent a young enslaved boy to St. Aurelia for labor. He arrived barefoot, thin, and silent, carrying the mark of someone who had learned to survive by disappearing. He swept the floors, tended the gardens, carried heavy water buckets from dawn to dusk. In any other setting, he would have been just another servant, invisible, unnoticed. But in the convent, his very existence broke laws older than the walls themselves. St. Aurelia had never allowed a man inside its living quarters. Not a priest, not a laborer, not even a messenger. Yet here he was, a quiet shadow moving through corridors where no male footsteps had ever echoed. His presence unsettled everything. The air shifted. The sisters walked differently. Conversations hushed faster. Doors closed more quickly. Years of forced purity had left them brittle, and the unexpected sight of a boy working in the hallways stirred buried feelings they had spent lifetimes suppressing. But the convent's rules were stronger than their emotions. They swallowed their discomfort, buried it under rosaries and rituals, and pretended nothing had changed, except something had. Sister Magdalene felt it before anyone else. For decades, she had lived as though carved from stone, disciplined, obedient, unwavering. But the moment she saw the boy struggling with a heavy bucket near the garden, something in her shifted, a softness, a concern, a curiosity she did not understand. She watched him longer than she should have. She prayed harder that night than she had in years. The more she resisted the feeling, the stronger it became. Not desire, but a strange spiritual conviction. A belief that his arrival was not an accident, that God had placed him in her path for a divine reason. She tried to confess this confusion to Mother Superior, but the older nun dismissed her, telling her to fast until the temptation passed. But it didn't pass. It grew. Days turned into weeks. Sister Magdalene found reasons to be in areas where he worked, offering help with tasks, asking questions about his past, speaking to him in tones too gentle for convent life. She believed she was protecting him. She believed she was guiding him. She believed God was using her as a vessel. The other sisters noticed long before she realized she had changed. They whispered among themselves, watching her tremble during prayer, watching her stare too long at the shadows near the cellar where he slept. They saw her humanity awakening, and they feared it, because they knew the truth St. Aurelia was built upon. Repressed emotion always finds a way out, and it never comes out quietly. The convent's pressure had already turned saints into shadows, but Sister Magdalene's unraveling was something new, something dangerous. The balance of holiness and human nature tilted, and even the walls seemed to sense a storm coming. Every rule that had once held the sisters together now became a trap tightening around them. The arrival of the boy cracked open every buried secret, every hidden emotion, every suppressed longing. The convent was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cauldron. The forbidden convent was not forbidden because of its rules, it was forbidden because the rules created the very sin they tried to prevent, and in that pressure Sister Magdalene's fate, and the scandal that would burn through history, was already beginning to form, quiet as a breath, hidden as a prayer, inevitable as a curse. Religion, in its purest form, is meant to cleanse the human spirit, but in the remote Oklahoma convent where Sister Marian lived, it was a curtain behind which the darkest sins were silently staged. Keynote 2 focuses on the dangerous system that allowed her pregnancy to be repackaged as a heaven-sent miracle rather than the scandal it truly was. This was not a story about love, nor was it an accidental lapse in discipline. It was a carefully stitched narrative crafted by frightened women who believed that the only thing more powerful than truth was the illusion of holiness. To understand how the convent weaponized faith, one must first understand the world those nuns lived in. The convent operated like a closed kingdom, isolated, insulated, and loyal to its own survival. Outsiders rarely entered, insiders rarely left, and secrets were tucked into every silent corridor. These women lived under vows of obedience and purity, yet they were still human enough to fear disgrace. A single rumor of sexual scandal could lead to the convent's collapse, loss of funding, and permanent shame in the eyes of the church. So when Sister Marian's belly began to swell, the first instinct was not compassion or righteous discipline, it was protection. Not protection of her, nor of the unborn child, but protection of the institution itself. The Mother Superior was the first to notice the signs. Her stern eyes, trained through decades of policing sin, saw the slight change in posture, the way Marian touched her stomach when she thought no one was looking. At first she prayed it was illness. Illness could be healed. Illness carried no shame. But the truth became undeniable. Marian carried life inside her. The problem was not only Marian's vow of chastity. The problem was who had fathered the child. A slave boy, 12 years younger than Marian, who cleaned the convent floors at night and worked the nearby farmland during the day. The very idea of a nun, an exalted bride of Christ, entangled with someone the church considered property was unthinkable. It was the kind of discovery that could bring bishops to their doorstep, newspapers to their gate, and judgment from every village pew. So the Mother Superior called for a secret meeting. The room smelled of incense and fear. The candles flickered against stone walls as 5 senior nuns gathered around the table. Some were trembling, others already wore faces carved with strategy. Marian was not invited. Marian was the problem to be solved. Every option was discussed: quiet punishment, forced confession, hiding her away until childbirth, or sending her to a distant convent. But every option created risk. What if someone talked? What if another nun whispered the truth in guilt? What if the slave boy, unaware of the danger he faced, mentioned something to the wrong person? Silence was safer. Silence protected all of them. And so it was decided the story would be rewritten. The Mother Superior formulated the narrative with chilling precision. Marian would not be punished, she would be sanctified. Her pregnancy would be declared a miracle, a divine message to strengthen the faith of the community. After all, religious history was littered with tales of impossible conceptions and heavenly signs. The world wanted miracles, and miracles were easier to accept than shame. The cover story spread quickly. Marian had received a vision from the Virgin Mary herself. A great blessing would soon be born into the world. A spiritual child, a chosen one. The nuns were instructed to speak of it with awe, never fear. They were told to behave as if they had witnessed something holy, not something sinful. And because they too lived in terror of consequences, they obeyed. Marian, meanwhile, was isolated, partly to protect the narrative, partly to keep her quiet. When she first heard what the convent intended to claim, she felt a mixture of disbelief and horror. She tried to protest. She tried to confess. She even tried to tell them that the boy had not forced her, that their forbidden connection was something far more complicated than sin. But no one wanted her truth. The convent wanted its story. The Mother Superior silenced her with a cold voice. Do you wish to damn us all? You will speak of visions, you will speak of grace, nothing more. Marian realized she was trapped, not with chains, but with faith warped into a weapon. She knew she could not run. Runaway nuns were hunted with more urgency than runaway slaves. The convent owned her life, and now it owned her story. As her pregnancy progressed, visitors and donors came to witness the supposed miracle. Wealthy women brought gifts. Priests arrived to observe her. Many believed, some doubted. But the Mother Superior's flawless performance quelled every question. Marian was instructed to remain humble, serene, and grateful. Every word she spoke was inspected, every movement judged. Meanwhile, the slave boy, the real father, sensed the shift. Guards watched him more closely. His work assignments changed. Whispered orders followed him. He realized too late that the convent was not going to protect him, it was going to erase him. The deeper tragedy of Keynote 2 lies not only in the cruelty of the lie, but in the deliberate sanctification of sin. Religion became a mask, not for holiness, but for survival. The convent used scripture like a shield, twisting the language of miracles into a sanctuary for their reputation. Marian's body became their narrative, her suffering their silent offering to maintain power. The child inside her became both a symbol and a secret, a living reminder of how institutions often care more about appearance than truth. Most disturbing of all, Marian slowly became part of the lie. When you are told to repeat a story long enough, especially under threat, it begins to reshape the mind. Her guilt turned into confusion, her confusion into resignation, and resignation into belief. This is how faith, when corrupted, becomes a prison. And this is how one woman's humanity was buried beneath the weight of a miracle she never asked for. While the world inside the convent was shifting into a carefully orchestrated miracle, the boy at the center of the truth was living through another kind of hell, one shaped by fear, silence, and the brutal realities of enslavement. Keynote 3 focuses on him, the young slave whose existence became the most dangerous secret in Oklahoma. His life had always belonged to others, but now it was at risk in ways he had never imagined. Before the scandal, he was invisible in the convent the way most slaves were, seen when needed, forgotten when not. He swept floors, carried buckets, scrubbed stone steps until his fingers bled. The nuns rarely spoke to him except to give commands or chastise mistakes. He was useful but never acknowledged as human. His job was to move quietly, breathe quietly, exist quietly. But after Sister Marian's pregnancy, the air around him thickened. The same nuns who ignored him before now watched him with suspicion and whispered in corners when they thought he couldn't hear. Their glances lingered too long. Their silence felt heavy. The boy felt a shift before he understood the cause. The first sign of danger came when the overseer pulled him aside after evening chores. The man's voice was low, sharp, and trembling with irritation. "You keep your head down. You don't speak unless spoken to. And you don't look at any of them, especially not Sister Marian. Do you understand?" The boy didn't know what he was being accused of, but he knew enough about the world to understand that when white men were tense, black boys died. So he nodded, quietly, fearfully. His heart thumped against his ribs like a trapped animal. It wasn't long before he learned why. One night he overheard two nuns arguing behind a half-open door, their voices cracked with panic. What if someone finds out? He must be kept under control. He can't talk, not a word. If he ruins this miracle story, we are all finished. Miracle story. He froze when he heard it. A strange chill ran through him. Something inside him sank as the truth assembled itself piece by piece. They were talking about him, about Marian, about the baby. In that moment, the boy understood the magnitude of his danger. For a white man to father a child with a nun would be a scandal. But a slave boy? That wasn't scandal. That was a sin the church would bury with bodies. From then on, the convent became a maze of traps. Every step he took felt monitored. Every breath felt borrowed. Whispered conversations silenced when he entered a room. He noticed how the older nuns kept keys on tighter chains and how the younger ones feared being alone near him, not because of him, but because they feared guilt by proximity. One evening, Sister Agnes, the only nun who had ever shown him any kindness, found him shaking after a harsh scolding by the overseer. She approached him with gentle steps. "Do not speak of anything you know," she whispered. "You did nothing wrong, but if you talk, they will destroy you." Her face carried sorrow, not accusation. The boy recognized it as the expression of someone too powerless to help, but too human to pretend not to care. "Is the baby mine?" The question slipped out, barely audible. Agnes closed her eyes as if wounded by the truth. "Yes. And that is why you must survive this quietly." Survive, not live, survive. That was the reality of his existence. And now survival required silence, but silence for him was not simple. He was young, barely 17. He had never been allowed to express emotion, let alone navigate the complexity of guilt, affection, fear, and fatherhood. Yes, he had feelings for Marion. He didn't have the language for it, but he knew the nights they shared were not driven by force. They were born of loneliness, isolation, and two broken souls reaching for warmth in a world that denied them humanity. Yet intentions didn't matter. In this world, love between them was blasphemy, and the consequences would fall hardest on him. The overseer grew more aggressive in the weeks that followed. He was assigned heavier labor, lifting barrels, chopping wood until his arms ached, digging trenches in the cold wind. They pushed him until exhaustion silenced any thought he might have had of rebellion or confession. Meanwhile, Marion's isolation grew too. Though he never saw her directly, he heard the changes. He noticed the way candles burned later in the chapel. He noticed how her voice, once clear and melodic during prayer hymns, had grown faint. They kept her hidden like a stolen artifact. Some nights he found himself wandering near the small garden where they had first spoken in secrecy. It was where she once laughed softly at something he said, where she touched his hand with trembling bravery, where they first shared the feeling that the world had forgotten them both. But now the garden felt like a graveyard for memories. His grief and fear had no safe outlet. He couldn't talk to the overseer, couldn't talk to the nuns, couldn't talk to Marion, so he carried the burden alone, each day sinking deeper into the understanding that his own life might be taken not because of wrongdoing, but because the truth was too dangerous. The most heartbreaking moment came when he was summoned to the Mother Superior. She dismissed the guards and looked at him with a coldness he couldn't decipher. "You will forget," she said. "You will speak of nothing. You will not claim the child. You will behave as if Sister Marion is a stranger to you." He wanted to speak, to defend Marion, to defend himself, to say that he cared for her in ways the world refused to imagine, but his throat tightened, his voice vanished. This woman was not just a nun, she controlled his fate. "And if anyone asks," she added softly, "you will swear by God that you know nothing." Her voice carried the threat she did not speak aloud. After that meeting, the boy changed. He worked silently. He slept lightly. He avoided eye contact with anyone. He learned to blend deeper into invisibility, to shrink into the corners of rooms, to exist only as a shadow, but inside him the fear remained, a silent scream trapped in the body of a boy who had loved someone he was never allowed to love, fathered a child he would never be allowed to claim, and survived a story the world would never allow to be true. Because in the eyes of the convent, the miracle they created needed no father, and the boy who truly was one was erased. The cold stone corridors of the convent were alive with secrets. By day they echoed with the quiet devotion of the sisters. Prayers murmured behind heavy wooden doors, the soft shuffle of sandals on flagstone floors, the whispered passages of novices learning their devotions. But as night fell, the convent transformed. The air grew heavier, damp from the cold that seeped through centuries-old walls, and a silence descended that was more than absence of sound. It was a presence, a waiting. Within this silence, some heard things that would chill the soul, muffled voices, hurried footsteps, the faintest hint of struggle, all coming from the cellar beneath the convent's foundation. The cellar itself was a place few dared to enter. It smelled of mildew, rotting wood, and the faint tang of iron. Lanterns cast long, wavering shadows that danced across the walls, turning the stacks of crates, jars, and old tools into grotesque shapes. The sisters whispered among themselves that the cellar was meant for storing wine, dried herbs, and the occasional provisions. But those who had dared to descend alone, or even linger at the doorway, spoke of a different truth. Whispers of midnight visits, of forbidden rituals, and of secrets no holy text should hold, traveled cautiously from lip to lip. Fear kept most silent, for speaking too loudly or too boldly risked scandal, or worse, moral corruption. It was during these nightly hours that some sisters began to notice strange patterns, footsteps, always light, as if someone were trying to avoid the creak of the floorboards. Voices, low and urgent, almost pleading, bouncing off the stone walls. Doors that should have remained closed were slightly ajar when they were certain they had been latched tight. But the fear of sin, fear of committing sacrilege by prying into matters that might be unholy, kept the sisters paralyzed. The religious doctrine instilled in them from the moment they took their vows dictated obedience, silence, and trust in divine order, even when reason screamed otherwise. They prayed, whispered Hail Marys, and convinced themselves that the noises were mere figments of imagination or punishment for their wandering thoughts. Yet the reality in the cellars was far more sinister. Those who had ventured near spoke of a nun, though not all agreed it was a nun, moving with uncanny stealth. She appeared only in the dim light, a shadow among shadows. Her presence felt more than seen. Some claimed to hear her whispering prayers not in the convent's sanctioned Latin but in a strange, halting dialect that blended fear and incantation. Others insisted they saw the faint flicker of candlelight in the cellar window long after the convent had been locked for the night, and always there was the feeling that some dark act was taking place, hidden behind the guise of devotion, that morality itself trembled in those damp corners. The psychology of the sisters must be considered. Fear was a constant companion in the convent, the fear of God, of sin, and of eternal damnation. To hear voices or footsteps at night was not merely eerie, it was dangerous. The mind of a devout nun was trained to attribute any anomaly to either divine trial or demonic temptation. In this context, witnessing or even suspecting another sister engaging in clandestine activity would have been terrifying. The rules of obedience prevented questioning openly. The rules of piety demanded silence, and the rules of conscience demanded vigilance over one's own sins. Thus, the strange happenings were observed in shadows and in silence, whispered only when the danger of reprisal or spiritual contamination seemed minimal. But why the cellar? There is something inherently sinister about places beneath the surface. In architecture, the cellar is a liminal space, hidden from the world, isolated and insulated. In religious settings, such hidden areas often became repositories for shameful secrets, forbidden knowledge, relics of heresy, or even objects too mundane yet too dangerous to leave in the open. In this particular convent, the cellar became a stage for midnight acts that the sisters above dared not acknowledge. Some suggest that the figure, or figures, venturing into the cellar were enacting punishments, performing rituals, or engaging in forbidden transactions, acts that required secrecy but carried the psychological thrill of danger. Even as the nights dragged on, the pattern of visits persisted. The sisters above could hear them moving carefully, voices almost pleading, objects being shifted, footsteps ascending and descending stairs with ghostly precision. They speculated, was it a secret sin? A clandestine romantic liaison? A ritual invoking powers beyond the church's understanding? The ambiguity itself was terrifying, for the mind prefers clarity, yet the unknown lingers, festers, and grows in influence over the imagination. Each muffled word, each echoing footfall, became a story in itself, rumors embroidered with fear, suspicion, and guilt. Over time, some nuns attempted intervention, though discreetly. A candle placed near the cellar door to illuminate the darkness. A whispered question through the keyhole. Even these small gestures were acts of courage, acts of rebellion, yet often yielded no answers. The cellar remained a place of whispered mystery. The midnight visits continued, and the convent above carried on with its rituals of prayer and devotion, pretending ignorance for fear of spiritual consequences. In the end, the significance of these midnight cellar visits lies not only in the act itself, but in the effect it had on the psyche of the convent. Fear became a shared secret, an unspoken contract among the sisters. Silence was maintained as a moral obligation, curiosity was suppressed as a sin, and the tension between the seen and the unseen defined their lives. The cellar visits were a mirror to the hidden, darker recesses of human nature, the parts of devotion, guilt, desire, and fear that cannot be publicly acknowledged, yet which dictate behavior in ways overtly holy institutions could never admit. Thus, the cellars became more than storage spaces. They were theaters of shadow, confession, temptation, and possibly sin. They were the repository of acts too dangerous to confront, yet too compelling to ignore. And the sisters, bound by faith and fear alike, carried the echo of footsteps in their dreams, heard the muffled whispers in their prayers, and learned that in some spaces, especially those beneath the surface of stone and sanctity, the human soul meets its darkest truths, hidden in plain sight. The convent had always been a place of rigid order and unwavering devotion, yet it was within this strict sanctity that the impossible seemed to take root. Sister Magdalene, a figure both admired and feared among her peers, began to exhibit signs that could not be ignored, a swelling of her belly that grew unmistakably week by week. For the sisters who had dedicated their lives to a strict regimen of prayer, penance, and asceticism, this development was incomprehensible. Celibacy was a vow etched into every aspect of their existence. The very idea that a nun could conceive was considered blasphemy. And yet, Magdalene's insistence that her pregnancy was a miracle challenged the very foundations of their faith, creating a tension that rippled throughout the stone halls of the convent. From the moment the first whispers began, fear and fascination intertwined among the sisters. Some recoiled at the notion, unable to reconcile Magdalene's outward piety with the physical evidence before them. Others, more credulous, clung to her explanations with a desperate faith, imagining that the child might be a divine messenger, a living sign of God's favor. Magdalene herself was unwavering. She spoke with conviction, her voice a mixture of authority and vulnerability, declaring that the child she carried was a holy gift, a miraculous presence that had been placed within her womb by the hand of heaven itself. In her eyes, the pregnancy was not sin, it was revelation. The psychological implications of this claim were profound. In a society and religious order that prized obedience above all else, Magdalene's assertion was at once revolutionary and terrifying. To question her would be to risk accusation of sacrilege, yet to accept it required a suspension of reason that few could easily achieve. The sisters found themselves navigating a treacherous moral landscape. Fear of divine punishment clashed with fear of scandal, obedience with doubt, faith with instinct. Every glance at Magdalene's growing belly became a meditation on the nature of belief. Was this truly a miracle, or a transgression cleverly concealed beneath the mantle of sanctity? The physical environment of the convent amplified the tension. The stone walls, cold and unyielding, seemed to reflect whispers and secretive glances back upon those who dared to enter the inner sanctum. The infirmary, where Magdalene's condition required occasional monitoring, became a space thick with suspicion. Sisters were dispatched under the guise of care, yet each visit felt like an interrogation, a ritual in which every gesture, every sigh, every faltering response could be construed as evidence of either virtue or guilt. Even the Mother Superior, normally a figure of unwavering authority, found herself in a delicate dance, maintaining discipline while navigating the extraordinary claims of one of her charges. The scandal, though largely contained within the convent's walls, had subtle echoes beyond them. Letters to visiting clergy, reports to distant bishops, and rumors whispered to local townsfolk created an atmosphere of scrutiny that Magdalene herself seemed to court. The child became a symbol not merely of her personal conviction, but of the tensions inherent in religious life, the friction between human desire and divine expectation, between secrecy and confession, between the observable world and the mysteries of faith. To outsiders, the pregnancy was impossible, yet the sisters who witnessed it daily could neither deny its reality nor dismiss its claimed sanctity. Magdalene's insistence on the miraculous nature of her pregnancy also shaped her behavior. She adopted a heightened austerity, a ritualized devotion that suggested both penitence and preparation for the arrival of a sacred being. She prayed for hours on end, fasted, and performed small acts of charity with a devotion that bordered on obsession. Yet these very acts of piety were layered with ambiguity. Were they genuine expressions of faith, or attempts to veil the unnatural circumstances of conception? The sisters, for all their devotion, were unable to answer, leaving them suspended in a state of anxiety and reverent curiosity. The tension reached its peak during moments when Magdalene's condition could no longer be hidden. Clothing stretched tightly over her body, revealing undeniable evidence of life growing within her. Even sisters who had previously doubted were forced into confrontation with reality. At these moments, silence became a strategy, a collective effort to maintain the semblance of order in the face of something that defied it. Yet beneath this silence was a rich undercurrent of speculation, whispered theories of divine intervention, and darker suspicions of human transgression. The convent became a theater of contradictions, where the sacred and the profane coexisted in uneasy proximity. From a historical perspective, the situation illuminates the pressures and paradoxes of religious life in the 1800s. Convents, particularly those isolated from the broader community, were microcosms of hierarchical power, surveillance, and strict moral codes. Any deviation from prescribed behavior, especially one as visible and undeniable as pregnancy, threatened not only the individual but the institution itself. Magdalene's assertion of divine purpose functioned both as a shield and a challenge. A shield against accusation, because to contradict her risked spiritual peril, and a challenge to authority, because it undermined the certainty of the convent's moral framework. Yet there was an undeniable allure to the claim. The possibility that a nun could become a vessel of divine intervention captivated the imagination of many sisters. It created an almost magnetic tension, a mixture of awe, fear, and desire to witness the unfolding miracle. Every movement Magdalene made, every whispered prayer, every public demonstration of devotion became an event charged with significance. The convent, normally a space of routine and ritual, transformed into a site of suspense, wonder, and moral uncertainty. Ultimately, the mysterious pregnancy exemplified the collision of faith and human experience, of devotion and doubt, of secrecy and revelation. Magdalene's unwavering conviction, coupled with the visible reality of her condition, forced the sisters, and by extension, the institution, to confront questions they had long avoided. What is sin? What is miracle? How much of human experience can truly be contained within the walls of sanctity? The pregnancy was more than a personal event. It was a mirror reflecting the deepest fears, hopes, and hypocrisies of a cloistered society governed by faith. In the end, whether the child was truly a miracle or a hidden transgression remained unknowable. What mattered most was the psychological and social impact on the convent, the fear, the awe, the tension between obedience and curiosity, and the ever-present shadow of what lies beneath the surface of human piety. Sister Magdalene's body became a site of mystery and moral ambiguity, a living testament to the complex interplay between devotion, secrecy, and the unknowable will of heaven. The moment the scandal of Sister Magdalene's mysterious pregnancy began to circulate, even in hushed whispers within the convent, the higher authorities of the church were alerted. What should have remained, a private matter of devotion and piety, had become a threat to the image of sanctity the institution had carefully cultivated over decades. Rumors, once whispered behind closed doors, had the dangerous potential to escape into the wider world. For the church, reputation was paramount. The notion of a nun defying her vows, even under the claim of divine intervention, was intolerable. Thus began a systematic, covert campaign to contain, manipulate, and ultimately erase the scandal before it could fracture the delicate veneer of holiness. The first sign of the church's intervention was subtle but chilling. Priests arrived under the cover of night, their presence announced only by soft shuffling of sandals across the convent's flagstone corridors, and the quiet tap of keys unlocking doors that had been firmly latched. They did not enter as saviors or ministers of faith. They entered as agents of authority and control. Their faces, set in grim lines, betrayed no warmth, only the rigid determination of men accustomed to wielding power over both the spiritual and the temporal. The sisters who caught sight of them through half-open doors felt a shiver of fear. These men were not here to comfort, but to command, to investigate, to dominate. The methods employed were both psychological and coercive. Interrogations took place in dimly lit chambers. the walls lined with cold stone that seemed to amplify every word. Nuns were questioned individually, their responses scrutinized for inconsistencies, their every gesture noted. The priests' questions were direct and relentless, probing not only for facts but for allegiance, who knew what, who had spoken, who had doubted. Sisters who faltered in their answers were subjected to quiet threats, reminders of spiritual consequences, hints of punishment both temporal and eternal. The convent, once a sanctuary of structured devotion, became a cage of tension and fear where the line between obedience and complicity blurred. The church's approach was calculated. Silence was demanded, not requested. The priests emphasized that any word spoken outside the convent walls would bring divine wrath, scandal, and possibly civil repercussions. Letters to the bishop, reports to distant authorities, and the subtle insinuation of excommunication worked to ensure that no sister dared voice what she had seen or heard. Gossip, once the currency of curiosity and social bonds, was replaced by an oppressive quiet, a suffocating fear that hung in every corridor and cloistered room. The convent's usual routines continued, but they were now punctuated by the anxiety of surveillance. Every glance, every whispered prayer was filtered through the lens of potential scrutiny. The nuns themselves reacted in varied ways. Some submitted entirely, their faith intertwined with fear, internalizing the church's narrative and suppressing all evidence of doubt. Others resisted quietly, their thoughts a private rebellion, clinging to knowledge of what had occurred even as they outwardly conformed. And yet a few were paralyzed, caught in a liminal space between obedience and conscience, terrified that any misstep could lead to spiritual condemnation or worse. The psychological toll was immense. In a convent designed to nurture devotion, the very instruments of faith had become tools of control, converting fear into a weapon to enforce silence. One particularly chilling aspect of the cover-up was the emphasis on secrecy over truth. No investigation sought justice, nor did it aim to discern what had actually transpired. The goal was singular: to protect the church's image, preserve authority, and prevent any scandal from reaching public ears. Priests acted as gatekeepers of information, controlling who could speak, where rumors could circulate, and how events could be recorded. In effect, the convent became a theater in which reality was obscured, manipulated, and ultimately erased at the discretion of those in power. Facts became irrelevant, appearances alone were sacred. The oppressive atmosphere extended beyond the interrogations. Regular prayers, once sources of solace, were repurposed as instruments of conformity. Sisters were encouraged to pray for forgiveness, for clarity, and for guidance in maintaining silence. Public rituals were conducted with an added weight of surveillance, reinforcing the notion that eyes, both human and divine, were always watching. Even mundane tasks, such as preparing meals or tending the garden, were shadowed by an invisible expectation of obedience. Every act, however trivial, became a measure of loyalty and discretion, yet, despite the church's concerted efforts, tension could not be entirely suppressed. Whispered glances, fleeting expressions of disbelief, and the subtle but telling movements of Magdalene herself betrayed the underlying anxiety. The convent, while outwardly composed, was a pressure cooker of repressed knowledge. Fear maintained compliance, but it could not erase the truth entirely, that a nun had conceived a child, that the boundaries of piety had been transgressed, and that the church's authority, though formidable, was not absolute. Historically, the church's response reflects a broader pattern of institutional control during the 1800s. Convents and monasteries operated under strict hierarchies where obedience was paramount, and any threat to moral or public authority was dealt with swiftly and quietly. Scandals were contained internally, punitive measures, spiritual threats, and social isolation ensured compliance. Magdalene's case exemplifies the tension between human experience and institutional orthodoxy, highlighting how power was exercised not only through doctrine but through fear, secrecy, and the manipulation of knowledge. Ultimately, the church's cover-up illustrates the chilling efficiency of control within cloistered religious institutions. The nuns were left to navigate a world in which truth was subordinate to authority, conscience to coercion, and fear to faith. The convent's walls, once symbols of sanctuary and devotion, became barriers to transparency and moral reckoning. In their quest to protect an image of sanctity, the priests ensured that the story of Magdalene's pregnancy became less about miracle or transgression, and more about obedience and secrecy, a tale silenced before it could speak, yet whispered forever in the shadows of memory. In the end, the cover-up achieved its immediate goal. Outwardly, the convent maintained its reputation. Internally, fear and silence reigned. But in the hearts and minds of those who lived through it, the truth persisted, shadowed and secret, echoing in the cold stone corridors, a reminder that authority could enforce silence, but it could never fully erase what had been seen or felt. The disappearance of the young slave boy cast a long, oppressive shadow over the convent. For weeks his presence had been a quiet, almost invisible part of daily life, fetching water, tending the garden, assisting in the cellar. Yet his sudden absence exposed a fault line in the fragile equilibrium of fear, secrecy, and obedience that defined the cloistered institution. No one had seen him leave, no footstep betrayed his flight, and the morning revealed only a haunting emptiness where he had slept and worked. The immediate reaction was panic, though carefully masked by outward composure, for to openly question the circumstances of his disappearance risked drawing the attention of the priests who had already begun their campaign of intimidation. Speculation ran rampant among the sisters. Some whispered that he had fled into the surrounding woods, seeking freedom in the wilderness beyond the stone walls and iron gates. To those who had glimpsed the boy's curious eyes, quick movements, and restless spirit, the notion of escape seemed plausible. He had always been observant, listening to the hidden conversations in the convent, noting the strange midnight visits to the cellars, and sensing the tensions between Magdalene, the other nuns, and the covert priests. The idea that he had vanished of his own accord, slipping silently into the dark embrace of the forest, brought a mixture of hope and dread to those who speculated on his fate. Yet, an alternative, darker possibility haunted the corridors even more than the thought of escape. Some sisters feared that he had been taken by the priests themselves, removed forcibly to protect the church from further scandal. These men, whose authority had grown more omnipresent and menacing with each interrogation, were not known for mercy when confronting threats to their control. If the boy had witnessed acts deemed dangerous or improper, particularly related to Magdalene's mysterious pregnancy, his disappearance could very well have been preemptive, an act to silence a potential witness, to erase evidence that might unravel the careful narrative of holiness and obedience that the Church sought to maintain. The psychological impact of his vanishing was immediate and profound. Fear intensified within the convent, stretching taut the already fraying nerves of the sisters. Each sound, footsteps along the halls, doors creaking in the night, the distant whistle of wind through the trees, was interpreted as a signal, a warning, or perhaps a harbinger of the boy's fate. The silence where he had been became a presence in itself, a void that filled every room, every chamber, every whispered prayer. Convents, by their very nature, were places of discipline and controlled behavior, yet the inexplicable absence of this single boy introduced chaos, reminding the sisters that power, even divine or institutional power, was always accompanied by fragility. The dynamics of secrecy and obedience were also magnified by the disappearance. Sisters who had once murmured among themselves in quiet curiosity now refrained entirely from speaking, their voices choked with fear. Observers could not distinguish between guilt, fear, or sorrow, for all were masked beneath the habitual expressions of devotion. Every glance was calculated, every movement measured. The young boy, though absent, exerted an influence that no human authority could fully suppress. In his absence, the convent became a theater of speculation and anxiety, where the unknown was far more terrifying than the visible acts of control enforced by priests. Historically, the incident reflects the brutal pragmatism of religious and societal hierarchies in the 1800s. Slaves, even in convents, occupied liminal spaces, essential for labor, yet expendable in the eyes of those in power. The boy's potential knowledge of scandal made him dangerous, while his innocence and youth made him sympathetic. For the Church, the imperative to preserve reputation outweighed compassion or justice. For the sisters, moral conscience clashed with fear of reprisal. The disappearance, therefore, was not merely a matter of physical absence, but a reflection of structural cruelty and systemic prioritization of image over life. Moreover, the mysterious nature of the boy's vanishing amplified its mythos. Some sisters spoke in hushed tones of supernatural intervention. Perhaps he had been carried away by angels or spirits, a divine act preserving innocence from corruption. Others, darker in imagination, considered the boy a casualty of human malice, spirited away to prevent truths from surfacing, never to return. The uncertainty became a vessel for collective anxiety, a story that could be shaped to moralize, warn, or punish without ever needing verification. The convent itself became a character in this unfolding narrative, its walls seeming to close in on those left behind, whispering secrets that no one could fully articulate. The missing boy also highlighted the intersection of innocence and knowledge. Though young and ostensibly powerless, he had witnessed enough to pose a threat. In convents and institutions where observation could equate to evidence, where silence was as enforceable as law, the absence of one witness could stabilize or destabilize the delicate balance of control. In this case, his disappearance underscored the extreme measures those in authority would take to maintain secrecy, the removal of potential truth-tellers, the suppression of dissent, and the silencing of those whose mere presence endangered the constructed order. In the days following his vanishing, the atmosphere of the convent shifted perceptibly. Daily routines continued, but shadows grew longer in the corridors, the air colder, more oppressive. Sisters avoided each other's gaze, fearful that to express concern might be interpreted as complicity or suspicion. The mystery of the boy's fate became a lens through which every act was viewed, every sound interpreted, every glance analyzed. His absence was both a warning and a ghostly reminder that in institutions bound by rigid hierarchy and secrecy, the disappearance of one could reverberate like a tremor through the lives of many. Ultimately, the young slave's disappearance was more than a physical event. It was a moral and psychological rupture. Whether he fled to freedom or was forcibly taken by the priests, the consequence was the same. The convent was left in a state of heightened fear, suspended between the known and the unknown. The story of the boy became emblematic of the power wielded in silence, of lives shaped and crushed by authority, and of the ever-present tension between innocence and corruption in cloistered spaces. Even after years passed, those who had lived through his absence would recall it vividly. The empty bed, the silence in the garden, the unspoken question of what happened, these remained etched into the memory of the convent, a reminder that even the smallest figure could alter the entire ecosystem of fear, devotion, and secrecy. The boy's disappearance, though brief in occurrence, became eternal in its psychological imprint, haunting the sisters and the walls of the convent long after the footsteps that had once accompanied him faded into history. The convent, long a bastion of order and obedience, began to fracture under the weight of what it could not reconcile, Sister Magdalene's child. The presence of a living being, conceived in defiance of vows yet claimed as a divine miracle, created an unprecedented schism among the sisters. Faith, once a unifying force, became a dividing line. Fear, once collective, became individualized and factional. Overnight, the convent transformed from a single, coherent community into a battlefield of conscience, ideology, and paranoia. On one side stood those who believed the child was indeed a miracle, a vessel of God's will. These sisters observed Magdalene with awe and reverence, interpreting every gesture, every prayer, every act of devotion as evidence that heaven had intervened in their midst. To them, the child was a living testament to divine power, a symbol that even within the rigid confines of human morality, the supernatural could manifest. They whispered of prophecy, of sacred duty, and of protection, arguing that to harm the child or to doubt its holiness would invite wrath, spiritual punishment, or eternal sin. Their prayers grew longer, their vigilance more intense, and their loyalty to Magdalene became a form of devotion in itself. They shielded her with subtle acts of kindness, guided her movements in the convent, and ensured that eyes of suspicion rarely fell too heavily upon her or her unborn child. Yet, just as staunchly, another faction rose in opposition. These nuns, equally devout and deeply fearful, interpreted the pregnancy as a sin incarnate, a manifestation of corruption that threatened the moral fabric of their sacred order. Every whispered miracle was met with suspicion, every act of devotion viewed as a ruse to conceal transgression. They demanded that Magdalene be held accountable, that the child be removed from the convent, and that order be restored at any cost. For them, silence and inaction were complicity. To protect what they perceived as sin was to betray God himself. Their prayers were fierce and accusatory, their eyes constantly searching for signs of deception, their words filled with warning and censure. In their perception, the convent's sanctity had been violated, and divine wrath would follow if the matter were not rectified. This division did not remain abstract. It permeated every aspect of daily life, from shared meals to prayer sessions. In the chapel, sisters sat in quiet opposition, their eyes avoiding one another, their minds occupied with internal debates over loyalty, morality, and divine will. Meals became tense affairs, where a single glance could be interpreted as agreement or defiance. Tasks once performed collaboratively, cleaning, tending gardens, preparing the infirmary, now required careful negotiation to avoid confrontation. Even the Mother Superior, traditionally the embodiment of authority and mediator, found herself powerless to enforce unity. Her role shifted from guiding spiritual practice to managing an invisible war of faith, attempting to navigate between factions without igniting open conflict. The psychological consequences were profound. Sisters who supported the child felt the burden of constant vigilance, knowing that suspicion and hostility lurked around every corner. Fear was compounded by guilt. Was their protection of Magdalene truly righteous, or were they simply indulging in personal defiance? Conversely, those who condemned the pregnancy wrestled with dread. Every moment of judgment was tempered by the possibility of error, for if the child were divine, their actions would be sacrilege. The convent became a theater of anxiety, where silence, glances, and subtle gestures carried immense weight. Faith and fear intertwined so completely that even routine acts, drawing water, lighting candles, folding linens, were imbued with moral significance. Complicating matters further was the presence of external authorities. The priests sent to enforce silence and control continued their interventions, arriving sporadically, interrogating nuns, and subtly threatening punishment. Their presence acted as both a stabilizing and destabilizing force. Those aligned with faith found allies in the church, while those aligned with fear found themselves constrained by rules designed to enforce conformity. Yet even these men, representing institutional power, could not fully resolve the division, as the very nature of belief and doubt was immune to coercion. The schism within the convent persisted, silently but palpably, influencing every decision, movement, and interaction. Over time, rituals and prayers began to reflect the divide. Sisters supportive of the child created private devotions, lighting candles in hidden corners, whispering blessings over Magdalene's sleeping form, and invoking divine protection. Opponents responded with quiet fasting, confession, and fervent prayers for purification and justice. The convent became a dual space, one faction worshipping what they believed to be miracle, the other battling what they perceived as corruption. Each day reinforced the divide, each shared moment a negotiation between fear and faith. This tension also highlighted broader themes of morality, obedience, and the human struggle to reconcile authority with conscience. In the 1800s, religious institutions demanded absolute adherence to doctrine, yet human experience, desire, observation, intuition often defied simple categorization. The division among the nuns underscores the fragility of communal unity in the face of extraordinary circumstances, demonstrating how even those trained to surrender their wills entirely to God could find themselves torn between competing interpretations of morality. Ultimately, the convent was left in a precarious state of equilibrium. Neither faction could entirely dominate, and the presence of the child remained both a point of awe and a source of dread. The division was not merely ideological, it was embodied in every glance, whispered word, and unspoken fear. In this way, the convent itself became a living reflection of the struggle between faith and doubt, obedience and conscience, fear and reverence. The walls echoed not only with prayers but with tension, a reminder that in places dedicated to devotion, human uncertainty could fracture even the most sacred order. In the end, the schism over Magdalene's child became more than a question of morality or theology. It became a study in human psychology, a portrait of fear and belief intertwined, and a cautionary tale of what happens when extraordinary circumstances confront rigid authority. The convent, divided and tense, stood as a microcosm of the eternal struggle between light and shadow, faith and doubt, innocence and transgression. A silent battlefield where the stakes were nothing less than the soul itself. The night of the birth arrived like a tempest, both literally and metaphorically. Storm clouds had gathered over the convent, blotting out the moon and stars, and wind tore through the stone corridors with a fury that seemed almost supernatural. It was as if nature itself had been summoned to witness the unprecedented event unfolding within the convent walls. Sister Magdalene, laboring alone in a small, dimly lit chamber, became the epicenter of a storm, whose echoes would reverberate throughout the institution, forever altering the order's fragile equilibrium between faith and fear. The chamber was modest, barely large enough to accommodate the bed, the handful of candles that cast flickering shadows on the stone walls, and the midwife, or, in this case, the sister charged with assisting Magdalene, whose hands trembled with a mixture of duty and terror. Every movement in the room seemed magnified by the storm outside. The windows rattled against their frames, sending shards of glass-like shadows dancing across the floor. The flickering candlelight produced grotesque shapes that leapt across the walls, making the laboring nun appear alternately monstrous and divine, as though the very air of the room had been transformed into a stage for supernatural theater. The screams began early in the night, loud, raw, and uncontainable. They pierced the thick stone walls, reverberating down the corridors, and awakened nuns who had been pretending to sleep in the upper chambers. Some cowered behind doors, praying fervently for mercy, while others, drawn by curiosity or compassion, crept toward the sounds, only to be repelled by the harsh intensity of the cries. The birth was not merely a physical act, it was an event that demanded acknowledgement, an eruption of human vulnerability that defied decorum, tradition, and the careful silence that had defined the convent in the weeks prior. Candles toppled in the chaos, their flames sputtering before being extinguished, sending the room into intermittent darkness. Each flare of light illuminated faces twisted in strain, sweat gleaming on foreheads and hands gripping bedposts as if to anchor themselves against the forces of fate and fear. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within. Thunder rolled across the hills, wind howled through the eaves, and rain lashed against the windows as though the heavens themselves were participating in the labor. The convent's usual order, the predictable cadence of prayers, meals, and chores, was obliterated by a singular, all-consuming event that commanded every sensory faculty. And then the child was born. The first cry, raw and piercing, cut through the darkness and the storm with a force that was almost physical. It was a sound both terrible and miraculous, a signal that the convent's reality had shifted irreversibly. The echo of that cry traveled through corridors, up stone staircases, and into the hearts of sisters who had feared, doubted, and prayed. To those who had believed the pregnancy was a divine sign, it confirmed their faith in the most immediate and visceral way. To those who had seen it as sin incarnate, it became a source of panic, dread, and renewed determination to impose order and discipline upon a world that seemed increasingly uncontainable. The chaos did not end with the child's first breath. In the storm and confusion, small mishaps multiplied. Candles fell, splattering wax across the floor. Linens were soaked with water used to cleanse and comfort. Furniture was displaced in the urgency of tending to both mother and infant. The room became a theater of desperation and awe, every movement heavy with significance. The sisters who assisted, some trembling, some sobbing, some muttering prayers, acted as both midwives and witnesses to what was nothing less than a rupture in the convent's moral and spiritual fabric. The psychological impact on the convent was immediate and profound. The birth forced every nun to confront the reality of what had been whispered, feared, and denied. Silence could no longer protect them. Concealment was impossible in the face of crying, moving, living flesh. The presence of the child challenged doctrine, obedience, and belief, making every prayer, glance, and action a test of conscience. For some, it was overwhelming. the sound of life, so innocent yet so charged with implication, destabilized years of training in self-control and devotion. Others felt a surge of vindication, believing that they had been right to trust in the divine miracle that Magdalene had long proclaimed. Historically, the event underscores the fragility of institutional control in the face of raw human experience. Convents of the 1800s were designed to manage, suppress, and discipline the natural impulses of those within them. Yet the birth of a child, particularly under circumstances that defied the rigid codes of celibacy and obedience, illustrated the limits of power, the inability of authority to fully govern human events, and the complex interplay between sin, sanctity, and circumstance. The convent walls, meant to contain both body and spirit, proved insufficient. The birth was a reminder that life, in all its unpredictability, could not be completely subordinated to doctrine. The echoes of that night would linger long after the storm had passed and the convent had returned to its outward routines. The child's cry had become a symbol, a living testament to the tension between faith and transgression, between obedience and human reality. Sisters would remember the way shadows had danced across the walls, the smell of wax and rain, the intensity of the cries, and the feeling that something had shifted irrevocably. It was an event that defied neat categorization, at once terrifying, awe-inspiring, and morally destabilizing. In the days that followed, the convent would attempt to restore normalcy, but the impact of the birth could not be erased. The presence of the child transformed relationships, altered the balance of power, and reinforced the divisions between those who saw miracle and those who saw sin. Even the most disciplined sisters found themselves haunted by the memory of that stormy night, by the visceral sound of life asserting itself against all expectation, and by the knowledge that the world they had known had been irrevocably altered. Ultimately, the birth that shook the order was not merely a physical event, it was a seismic, psychological, and spiritual rupture. The convent, as a space of control, obedience, and devotion, had been confronted by an event that transcended structure, doctrine, and fear. The storm outside, the screams within, and the echoing cry of the child combined to create a moment in which mortality, divinity, and human frailty collided. The memory of that night would linger like a shadow in the stone halls, a permanent reminder that in the lives of the devout, miracles and chaos are never far apart, and that even the strictest order can be undone by the force of life itself. Even after decades had passed, long after Sister Magdalene had faded into the shadows of history, the story of her child refused to vanish. Within the surrounding town, whispers persisted. Rumors carried in hushed tones at markets, along riverbanks, and in the dim glow of candlelit taverns. The child, born under circumstances so extraordinary and scandalous, had transcended mortality to become legend. For some, he or she was a miraculous figure, a blessed child protected by the hand of God. For others, a cursed soul, a living reminder of sin and secrecy. The ambiguity of the child's fate mirrored the ambiguity of human belief itself, leaving an imprint that history could neither fully illuminate nor erase. The townspeople's fascination was fueled by the mixture of fear, awe, and moral curiosity. Stories circulated of a child who moved through the world untouched by harm, seemingly guided by divine providence. It was said that those who sought to interfere with the child's life suffered misfortune, crops failed, livestock perished, illnesses struck suddenly. To believers, these accounts were proof that the child remained under celestial protection, a living embodiment of miracle and sacred destiny. To skeptics, these stories were warnings, a testimony to the lingering shadow of a scandal carefully buried but never truly forgotten. Within the convent itself, the Church's legacy of secrecy ensured that few concrete details ever emerged. Records were meticulously controlled, mentions in official correspondence redacted or destroyed, and witnesses threatened into silence. The nuns who had been alive during Magdalene's life were either gone or too fearful to speak, leaving only fragmentary memories, fleeting glances, whispered prayers, and private fears that could never be reconciled with public testimony. In this silence, myth took hold, fact and fiction intertwined, producing a narrative more powerful than truth could ever be. The child's identity, the circumstances of birth, and even their survival became mutable, shifting with each retelling laden with moral and spiritual undertones. The legend's endurance was also psychological. For generations, the Blessed Child symbolized the tension between human desire and divine order, between sin and sanctity. Parents would tell children stories of the child as both warning and inspiration, a means to teach obedience and reverence, while also offering hope that miracles could appear even in the most forbidden of circumstances. Scholars and clergy debated in private chambers whether such legends were remnants of divine intervention or tools of social control. Either way, the child became a vessel for communal fears and aspirations, a figure through which society could grapple with questions of morality, authority, and the unknowable will of heaven. Some claimed that the child carried extraordinary gifts. Sightings, though rare and never verified, suggested the child possessed an uncanny wisdom, an ability to heal minor ailments, or a preternatural understanding of human character. Whether these claims were true or mere embellishments, they reinforced the notion that the child was touched by something beyond mortal comprehension. The legend thus functioned on multiple levels, as a tale of divine favor, a warning against moral transgression, and a psychological mechanism through which the community could process the lingering mystery of Magdalene's pregnancy. Yet not all accounts were positive. Certain factions, particularly those aligned with stricter interpretations of religious law, insisted the child was cursed, a living emblem of sin that had been hidden, not by God's mercy, but by the Church's fear and prudence. According to these narratives, misfortune that befell the town, unexplained illnesses, failed crops, sudden deaths, was attributed to the lingering presence of the child. The Church, in silencing witnesses and destroying records, had attempted to bury the truth, but the moral and spiritual consequences of the events had seeped into collective memory. In this way, the child became both blessing and curse, simultaneously revered and feared, a locus of tension between divine justice and human agency. Historically, the legend demonstrates the power of narrative and secrecy in shaping collective memory. The Church's efforts to cover up Magdalene's pregnancy, coupled with the convent's internal divisions and the mysterious disappearance of the young slave, created fertile ground for myth. When events cannot be openly examined, human imagination fills the gaps, producing stories that satisfy psychological needs for order, morality, and explanation. The child, therefore, was not merely a historical figure. The child became a mirror for the anxieties, hopes, and moral imagination of generations. Psychologically, the legend also reflects the deep human need to reconcile contradiction. The child, born under scandalous circumstances but claimed as divine, embodied paradox. The town's collective memory struggled to interpret the event in ways that could make sense of morality, faith, and fate. Believers emphasized the miraculous, skeptics emphasized sin, and the Church emphasized silence, creating a triad of interpretations that allowed the story to endure without resolution. Every retelling reinforced ambiguity, ensuring that the legend would persist long after witnesses had vanished. Even decades later, those who encountered relics of the convent, unused corridors, abandoned chapels, and silent bell towers, claimed to feel the lingering presence of the child, the echo of footsteps in empty halls, the faint flicker of candlelight, the sudden cold that seemed to emanate from nowhere. These were taken as signs that the child or the memory of the child remained enmeshed in the spiritual landscape. Such stories blurred the boundary between history and legend, creating a Gothic tapestry in which the miraculous and the terrifying coexisted. Ultimately, the story of the Blessed Child endures because it encapsulates the intersection of human fear, faith, and fascination. It is a narrative of secrecy and revelation, of divine touch and institutional control, of innocence and moral ambiguity. The Church may have attempted to suppress the truth, but legend proved more resilient than authority. The child, whether truly miraculous or merely the product of rumor and memory, became immortal within the imagination of the town and beyond, a symbol of the limits of human control and the enduring power of mystery. In the end, the Blessed Child exists as both story and symbol. Protected by God or cursed by circumstance, the child's legend reminds all who hear it that truth can be hidden, but it cannot be entirely destroyed. Memory, imagination, and myth ensure that certain events, particularly those that challenge authority, morality, and belief, echo across generations, haunting the hearts of those who lived through them and the minds of those yet to come. The convent, the church, the nuns, and the community are all forever bound to that night of miracles, fear, and secrecy, a story that endures as a dark jewel in the annals of human history. In the centuries-old stone walls of the convent, the echoes of Sister Magdalene's life and the child she bore linger like a shadow that refuses to fade. This is a story of secrets, faith, and fear, where the ordinary rules of morality and obedience were shattered by events that defied both reason and doctrine. From whispered footsteps in the cold midnight cellars to the anguished cries during a stormy birth, the tale captures a world where the sacred and the profane collided in the most devastating and unforgettable ways. Every corner of the convent, every creaking stair, and every flickering candle bore witness to acts that would haunt the sisters for decades, and the repercussions extended far beyond the stone walls into the imagination of generations to come. The legend of Sister Magdalene's child, known in hushed tones as the Blessed Child, remains a symbol of both divine mystery and human transgression. To some, the child was a miracle sent by God as a beacon of hope and divine intervention in a world that demanded conformity and silence. To others, the child was a curse, a living embodiment of sin, a reminder of the fragility of human morality and the dangers of stepping outside the rigid codes imposed by both church and society. This duality is what gives the story its enduring power, making it resonate with anyone who has ever questioned authority, doubted what is presented as sacred, or wondered at the hidden forces that shape history in ways that official records often fail to capture. Beyond the immediate drama of pregnancy, birth, and disappearance, this tale reflects the larger tension between institutional control and human nature. The Church, in its efforts to suppress scandal, demonstrated both the reach of authority and the limits of power. Priests interrogated nuns, silenced witnesses, and attempted to erase all evidence of events that could destabilize faith, but even their meticulous cover-up could not prevent rumors, memories, and legends from taking root. History shows us that attempts to hide the truth often produce stories even more compelling, haunted, and enduring than the reality they seek to obscure. In this way, Sister Magdalene's narrative serves as both historical case study and Gothic allegory, a reminder that secrecy, fear, and devotion are intertwined, and that the human desire to know, witness, and remember can never be fully contained. Psychologically, the convent's fractures reveal the extremes to which fear and faith can drive individuals. Half the nuns saw the child as a sacred miracle, a living testament to divine will, while the other half condemned it as blasphemy, demanding action, punishment, and expulsion. This division reflects a universal truth about human societies. When confronted with events that defy understanding, people gravitate either toward reverence or condemnation, hope or terror. The tension between these opposing reactions creates fertile ground for legend, myth, and the stories that persist across generations. It is this same tension that continues to captivate readers, historians, and storytellers today. Even as decades passed and the convent fell silent, the story of the Blessed Child endured, carried in whispered rumors among townspeople, chronicled in fragmented memory, and interpreted in countless ways by those who sought meaning in the mysterious. Sightings, stories of miraculous protection, and accounts of misfortune attributed to the child reinforced the legend, ensuring it would outlast any attempt at institutional erasure. The child became immortal, not merely as a historical figure, but as a symbol of the collision between human ambition, divine mystery, and the shadowed corridors of history where power, secrecy, and faith intersect. For modern readers, historians, and seekers of dark history, the tale is more than a story. It is a lens into the 1800s, a glimpse at the strict hierarchies, moral codes, and fears that governed convent life, and a study of how secrecy and scandal shaped communities. It invites reflection on the ways that stories, myths, and legends persist in shaping culture, memory, and morality, long after the events themselves have passed. The birth that shook the convent, the disappearance of the young slave, and the Church's relentless cover-up all contribute to a narrative that is as psychologically rich as it is historically haunting. In the end, The legacy of Sister Magdalene and her child, the Blessed Child, serves as a reminder that some stories, no matter how carefully hidden or suppressed, refuse to die. They endure in memory, in legend, and in the spaces where history and imagination meet. They remind us that faith, fear, morality, and secrecy are eternally intertwined, and that even in the most controlled environments, life, mysterious, uncontrollable, and at times miraculous, finds a way to leave its mark. For those who dare to explore the dark corners of history, the Convent story stands as an indelible testament to the human struggle between obedience and truth, sin and sanctity, fear and wonder.